What if I told you that American housing market, the market often associated with free market capitalism, is actually one of the most heavily shaped by government policy? And here's the strange part. Germany, famous for having a much bigger role for the state in the economy, went in almost the opposite direction. So, how did two countries with such different economic systems end up facing serious housing problems? That's the puzzle at the heart of Alexander Reisenbichler's 2025 book, Through the Roof: Housing, Capitalism, and the State in America and Germany. And the answer tells us something much bigger about capitalism itself. We usually think about housing as a simple market. People want homes, developers build homes, banks provide mortgages, prices are determined by supply and demand. Simple, right? Not quite. Housing is not just a place where people live. It can also be an asset, a source of wealth, collateral for borrowing, a political issue, and as Reisenbichler argues, a central part of how entire economic system grow that changes everything. Let's start with the United States. The American economic model is usually described as market-oriented, but when it comes to housing, the government has played a remarkably important role. Over decades, American policy increasingly encouraged home ownership through tax advantages, mortgage institutions, and government-backed housing finance. In other words, the government wasn't simply standing outside the housing market. It was helping shape the market itself, and this created a powerful economic feedback loop. More people could access mortgages. More people could buy homes. Home ownership became an important way for households to accumulate wealth, and rising house prices could make existing house owners richer on paper. Housing wasn't just shelter anymore, it was becoming part of the financial system. Reisenbichler calls attention to this transformation as part of the financialization of the American economy and housing market. And this is where things get interesting, because a policy designed to expand home ownership can also make housing more economically important and potentially more vulnerable to financial instability. Now let's switch to Germany. You might expect Germany to have a very different housing story. After all, Germany has traditionally had a stronger social market tradition and a much larger role for institutions outside the pure market model. But housing policy took a surprisingly different path. Reisenbichler argues that Germany gradually reduced policy support for both home ownership and rental markets, while its economy increasingly relied on an export-oriented growth model. And this creates one of the book's central paradoxes. America and Germany pursued very different housing policies, but neither escaped housing problems. So maybe the question isn't simply, is the government involved? Maybe the better question is, what kind of capitalism is the government helping to build? This is the deeper idea behind the book. Different capitalist economics have different engines of growth. In the United States, household demand and housing became increasingly important. In Germany, exports played a much larger role, and housing policy evolved alongside these different growth strategies. That means housing policy isn't isolated from the rest of the economy. It can enforce the economic model itself. Think about it this way. If an economy encourages households to borrow and buy homes, rising housing values can support consumption and wealth accumulation. But if housing becomes too expensive, younger households and renters can be pushed out. And if households and financial institutions become heavily exposed to property prices, a housing downturn can become an economy-wide problem. This is one reason the housing crisis isn't simply a story about expensive houses. It is a story about finance, inequality, consumption, and economic growth. And this brings us to the financial crisis. The American housing boom of the 2000s wasn't just a real estate story. It became deeply connected to the financial system. Mortgages were transferred into financial assets. Credit expanded. House prices rose. And when the housing market collapsed, the consequences spread far beyond homeowners. The lesson wasn't simply don't let house prices rise too much. The deeper lesson was when housing becomes deeply integrated with finance, a housing problem can become a financial problem, and a financial problem can become an economic crisis. Reisenbichler's argument goes beyond simply explaining 2008 though. He asks why different capitalist economics developed such different relationships between the state, housing, and economic growth in the first place. But here's where Germany makes the story much more interesting. Germany didn't simply copy the American model. Its housing institutions developed differently. Its growth model was different. Its relationship with home ownership was different. And yet Germany eventually faced its own housing affordability pressures. This tells us something important. There may not be one universal housing model that automatically produces affordable housing. Different economic systems can create different problems. The same policy can have completely different consequences depending on the economic structure surrounding it. That's why simply saying, let the market handle housing or let the government handle housing may be asking the wrong question. The really uncomfortable conclusion is that there may be no completely neutral housing market. Governments influence housing through taxes, finance, regulation, infrastructure, and land use policy. Banks influence it through credit. Investors influence it through demand for property as an asset. Homeowners influence policies because they have a direct financial stake in property values, and renters experience the market from the other side. So when housing prices rise, the question isn't simply why aren't there enough houses? We should also ask what economic system rewards high housing prices, and who benefits when housing becomes an asset? Those questions take us from real estate into political economy. This is why Through the Roof is more interesting than a typical book about housing. It's not really just asking why are houses expensive. It's asking why do capitalist economies organize housing the way they do. America and Germany provide a fascinating comparison because their housing policies seem almost counterintuitive relative to their broader economic identities. The United States, supposedly the champion of markets, built extensive government support for home ownership. Germany, with a stronger tradition of state coordination, moved away from some forms of housing support, and both trajectories were connected to their broader models of economic growth. So the next time someone tells you that the housing crisis is simply a problem of supply and demand, remember this. A house isn't only a house. It's a home. It's an asset. It's collateral. It's a source of wealth. It's a political issue. And sometimes it's part of the engine that drives an entire economy. That's the bigger lesson of Through the Roof. Housing doesn't just reflect capitalism. Housing can help shape capitalism. And once you see housing that way, the housing crisis starts to look very different. If you enjoy Economics Explained through books, real-world evidence, and surprising economic stories, subscribe, because the next book might completely change the way you think about money.